Welcome back everyone to more NR 2003 at Knee Pit Gaming. In today's video, we're going to take a step away from our normal gameplay and actually talk about AI ratings. So I'm going to take you guys through my thought process and exactly how I go about determining the AI ratings for the various different mods and car sets that I use here in the game. Now, as far as NR 2003 is concerned in AI behavior or strength, there are basically three ways to control that overall. The first is through the track files, but we're going to set that one to the side and assume that you're not editing or creating your own tracks, and we're going to stick to what you really can take care of in game. So that means the next method is the very simple AI strength that is found here under both single race as well as your championship mode as well. My preference is to always leave everything at 100% when I'm doing my testing. That's going to be my frame of reference, and that way if the cars are too fast or too slow, I know that I'm at 100% and I will simply adjust the ratings from there. So our third and final method is the one that I spend by far and away the most time with, and that's the AI ratings for the individual car sets. Now, for our purposes today, we're going to be using the late model mod, and that's because, well, I just recently downloaded that for some gameplay that is going to be coming up here on the channel, and I needed to create not only a car set, but ratings for that car set, so here's how I did it. I'd like to start off by saying there is no one single way of doing ratings correctly. There's no right or wrong way of doing this. In fact, there are as many ways of setting AI ratings as there are people doing it. And you can spend as much or as little time with this as you like. In fact, while we're going to be looking at the opponent manager here in game in today's video, my preferred method of editing the AI ratings would be a separate piece of software called NRatings. And this software is amazing. It's been around absolutely forever. And it is my preferred method because it saves me so much time by allowing me to do bulk changes for the entire field or by grouping sections of cars together. And that's because the way I like to do ratings is first I do a lot of testing, and I'll have a small group of cars that I will test with, and essentially I will take the ratings, have everything identical except for one of these areas, and then I will test that for varying different levels, and I will see just how much it affects the racing, the lap times, the fall off, all those sorts of things. And then once I have my data, then I can come back in and start to set up the individual ratings. Now, the way I do that, once I've done my testing, is that I like to set aside tiers. And in a car set that's between 30 to 40 cars, and here you can see I've created a car set with 35 cars. And again, this is the car set you guys are going to see here on the channel when we go back to gameplay with the late model cars. So we're going to be doing a lot of short tracks with this mod. So the ratings are going to reflect the short tracks. And that's important to note because all of the ratings are going to differ based on exactly what you're looking for. If you're only looking for short track action, then you can do certain things that will affect that type of racing. Or if you're looking for more a NASCAR Cup style ratings format, then you can do some things that will make the racing better at all of the different types of tracks. So there's a lot of things to consider here. And as I mentioned, there is no right or wrong way of doing this. There are as many ways of doing this as there are people doing it, I can assure you. So what I'm showing you here today is simply my way of going about it. As far as the tiers, with a car set between 30 to 40 cars, I'm generally going to want 4 tiers. And that gives me the ability to break apart the drivers and divide them from tier 1, which would be my strongest drivers, the drivers I would expect to be running in the top 5 to top 10 on a regular basis, all the way down to the tier 4 drivers, who are the back markers. These are the guys that I would expect to be getting lapped and finishing in the bottom third or fourth of the field on a regular basis. However, my preference is to add some randomness to the field. So I don't want the same driver winning all the races. I don't want the same driver finishing last in all the races. I do want quite a bit of randomness to it. So you're going to see that as we get into the ratings. So let's go ahead and start off. I'm going to show you what a tier 1 driver rating or a series of ratings looks like, and then we'll take a look at a tier 4 and give you an idea of what the differences are, and then we'll go one by one through the ratings, and I'll show you exactly my thought process in each of these areas. So tier 1 will go Bubba Pollard, one of the most famous late model drivers in the country, and here are his ratings for this car set. Again, this is the car set I'm going to be using in the gameplay coming up very soon on the channel, and this is what they look like. So this is a tier 1 driver. So what I like to do before we go through each one of these, I like to assign the different drivers into tiers, and then once I have everything done for the car set, then I can go in and make personalized adjustments. Maybe I want some drivers in tier 1 to be a little bit stronger than others or weaker than others, and that way I don't necessarily just have 4 tiers, but I might have a few additional tiers that are caught in between the different ones. Again, not something I always do, but if there's one particular driver that I do want to run better or worse on a more regular basis, then I simply come in and make a few tweaks once I have the initial groundwork done. So that's what a tier 1 driver looks like right now. Now let's come in and choose the O2, who I believe is a tier 4 driver. And here's what those numbers look like. So while we're here, let's go ahead and talk about a few things. For this particular car set, the pit crew numbers don't mean anything to me. I simply chose a very wide range here because I wanted there to be a very wide range and a lot of randomness to the different pit crew, whether we're talking speed of the pit stops or their consistency on the pit stops. Again, just a very wide range here. And most of the races I run with these guys are going to be shorter anyway, so there's probably not going to be any pit stops, or there might be one pit stop. So this isn't a huge deal. So this is not something I spend a lot of time testing or playing around with. So again, just a nice wide range here so that there's some randomness involved. All right, so now that we've seen a tier 1 and a tier 4, let's actually come back out to Bubba Pollard, and I'm going to show you guys, we're going to go through the driver section, the vehicle section, and the pit crew section one by one. Let's get started with the driver ratings, and of course one of the most important, with aggression. So the aggression number is something that I don't want to get too high or too low. So I like to stay toward the middle with this one. Reason being, as you see here with the description that's going to pop up, this is how much room they're going to give the other AI drivers or you as the player car. This is how aggressive they are when trying to block or pass, all those things that can cause wrecks. So you get this number too high with aggression, you can cause a lot of wrecks. And this is going to take some testing. There is no perfect value that I have found here. So you'll notice that 50 to 80, so a pretty wide range of 30 here. But I don't get anywhere near 100 on the aggression. Now, I might, for one or two particular cars, if I know I've got a driver in the field that I want to be ultra aggressive, i.e. somebody like Joey Logano in the Cup Series, I might give them a little bit higher number, like maybe in this case an 85, maybe even up close to a 90, just to see if it works. But if I start to generate too many wrecks, then I will back off of these numbers. None of these are set in stone. These are my starting points, and then over time, I will make adjustments as needed. But for the most part, 50 to 80, somewhere in this range is what I have found that works really well for me, so that the cars actually do try to pass, but they're not so aggressive that it would get constant wrecks. But again, your mileage may vary based on the type of racing you're looking at, whether you're looking at only road courses, or in this case, only short tracks, and so on. So keep that in mind. Next up, we have 3 values that I use specifically for randomness. So we're talking about consistency, finishing, and qualifying. And the reason I do this is because I don't want to see the same guys all the time running at the front, in the back, in the middle, and so on. So I like to throw some randomness in there, and that's why we're going to see some wider ranges on these. Now, consistency is, well, how consistent a driver is each and every lap. So a driver with consistency close to 100 is going to hit their marks the same lap after lap after lap. So they're going to be running almost identical lap times all the time, but the more you reduce that, then their lap times will vary, as sometimes they'll miss their marks. Sometimes they'll get a little loose, a little tight, whatever the case may be, so that they're not just running lap after lap exactly the same speed. I would actually prefer this to be a little bit lower, but recent testing has showed me that maybe I need to bump this up somewhere around that 60 level or higher, because sometimes if I get it too low, I find that the cars, they don't behave exactly the way I would like. There's some real inconsistency in a bad way. Not just inconsistency with lap times, but maybe it creates more wrecks because these guys are doing some things that maybe the game was not designed for. So again, like to keep this a little bit more narrow range. I would prefer to use the 40 to 100 for consistency as well. But again, just something that recent testing has shown that maybe a little higher value works out well. And then we get into finishing and qualifying. So finishing is all about how the driver does as the race goes on. Do they get better, or do they actually fade somewhat as the race continues on? That's what I use this for, randomness throughout the race. What I don't want is to have the same drivers running in the same positions throughout the entire race and nothing ever change. Now there's going to be some of that to an extent anyway, depending on the type of track you're at and how easy or hard it is to pass. But the more I spread this out, and you can see there's a 60-point spread here, which is a pretty big spread. So what this could give me is a driver that maybe starts out very fast. So maybe he starts in the top 5 for the race, but he's got a very low number for finishing for that particular race, again, as it's randomly generated by the game. And maybe as the race goes on, he starts to fade from the top 5 to maybe 15th or 20th as the race goes on. Again, that's what you're looking at here in the finishing position. And of course, the opposite is also true. You could have a driver that starts maybe 15th, but has a very high finishing number. And so he gets stronger as the race goes on, and he turns that in maybe into a top 10 finishing position. And that takes us right into qualifying our next value, which is the opposite. So how good of a qualifier is this driver? Maybe they have a lot of speed, but they don't qualify very well. Maybe they're closer to this 40 than they are 100 on qualifying. So when the game generates that number, they get a low qualifying number, somewhere closer to 40. And so maybe they start midfield when they have one of the strongest cars. So again, it gives you an idea of comers and goers throughout the race with these 3 numbers: consistency, finishing, and qualifying. So the happier I am is when I can get the wider ranges in these values. Then we come into the track types. How good is the driver at road courses, short tracks, speedways, and super speedways? Now, don't worry too much about the terminology here. Super speedway is Daytona and Talladega, and tracks that are like that. Your restrictor plate type tracks. Then your speedways are anything that's basically over a mile in length. And then, of course, you get short tracks are shorter than a mile. And then finally, your road courses. So the way I like to do these is, this is where we get back into my tiers. And 70 will generally be my top tier most of the time as I get started testing. So I'll run a lot of test races, a lot of test qualifying sessions, and practice sessions and so on to see how these all play out. But generally I start at 70 on the max for tier 1. And you can see here, I've actually increased tier 1 all the way up to 100. And once again, I like to have a fairly wide spread. Now, in this case, I'm only using these cars at short tracks, so I just put some placeholders in for road courses, speedway, and super speedway. That's why you see 5 all the way up to 70. 5 is generally my lowest value that I would ever put on a car. I don't go all the way down to 0. So that's what this represents. The very strongest and the very weakest all at the same time. And all of the drivers have these for road courses, speedways, and super speedways, since I was focused entirely on short tracks here. But in this case, 45 to 100, that gets me some of the randomness that I was talking about. Because in this case, Bubba Pollard, if he is assigned 100 when the game assigns these values before the race starts or for the race weekend starts, then he is going to be much faster than he would be if he gets assigned a 45. So that gives me some variability and some randomness that I'm looking for. So let's say that you're not looking for randomness. Let's say that you want these guys to finish very close to the same spot each and every time they go to this particular track type. Well, then obviously you'd want your spread to be much smaller. Maybe you only want a spread of 5 to 10, maybe even 15 points between the men and the max. Whereas somebody like me looking for more randomness in there, in the finishing order and the running order, then I'm going to go with a bigger spread. In this case, a full 55 points. So that's how I do the driver ratings. Now let's move on to the vehicles. Out of all the areas when setting up AI ratings, the vehicle section is where I spend most of my time testing. And the reason is, this is where I can have the biggest impact on the speed of the cars, whether they spread out a lot over the course of a run or if they stay in packs. Things like that are really determined so easily and quickly in the vehicle section. And let's actually start the vehicle section at the very bottom with reliability. And the reason is, this is definitely going to be personal preference. You can see here I'm using a very wide spread, 40 to 100. The closer you get to 100 with these values, the less likely you are to have cars drop out of the race with a mechanical failure. Obviously, the lower the number is, the more likely you are to have cars that drop out of the race with failure. So with all of my cars in this particular car set, it's 40 to 100 to give some randomness to it, so that some races I might have 2 or 3 cars drop out. Other races I might not have any. So I never know exactly what I'm getting, which is first and foremost for me. The last thing I want is the same race over and over and over. So that's why you see the reliability with this wide spread. Now let's talk about the top 3 sections here. Let's go aerodynamics, chassis, and engine. Now the importance of each of these is based on the track type that you're on. For example, short tracks do not care about aerodynamics and really don't care a whole lot about engine. It's all about the chassis. So if I want the cars to have a very wide spread on speed, then I use a wide spread here. And this is where I get back to my tier concept. So this is a tier 1 car, 70 to 100. So if you're looking at, say, super speedway, for example, aerodynamics are huge. Same thing with engine. So you get the idea. Which of these 3 are most important will depend on the type of track you're at. So always keep that in mind. So for example, here with short track being the focus of this particular mod and car set, really what I'm focused on is the chassis. More than anything else, I'll spend most time on the chassis. If I am creating a car set that is all about the restrictor plate tracks, Daytona, Talladega, that type of thing, then I'm going to focus on aerodynamics and engine, and chassis will almost not matter very much at all. The real trick and the fun for me comes when I have a car set such as the Cup Series mod that we've been doing so much of our gameplay in. Well, I need those cars to be good at all the different types of tracks. So I have to find a nice balance here in order to get the results I'm looking for. So never forget that the adjustments you make in this section with aero, chassis, and engine might work great for one type of track, but completely ruin the racing at another type of track. So it's a lot about finding that middle ground that works for everything. But here, all I cared about was basically the chassis. Now, this is something I want to point out right now is pay very close attention to your maximums. So when we were back here in the driver ratings, I talked about for the individual tracks, generally I like to start with a 70 as my maximum. These are my tier 1 drivers, have a max of 70. In this case, based on some of my testing, I was able to get by with going all the way up to 100, which would be my preference, simply because it just makes the most sense to me that the strongest drivers would be max 100, strongest cars would be max 100. So I'm always going to try to work to that, but I start at 70. Well, in the vehicle section, I start at 90. That's where I start, and then if I can increase it from there, I will. Because overall, I like a car set that's pretty strong and difficult for me to get race wins or top fives. I really like to push myself with the ratings in order to make it difficult to get those really good finishes. That way, if I'm able to race for a win, then I know that I have worked hard to get it. So once again, the spreads. I'm going to leave these as wide as I can while still taking into account the different tiers. And this being a tier 1, you can see we've got 25 points between the men and the max. So that allows some variability. Again, when we're talking short tracks, it's not going to mean very much of anything. But if we get to, say, a speedway, this will definitely come into play. And it might mean a difference of 3 to 4 tenths at some tracks. Then with the chassis, here you can see I have gone up to 100 here because based on my testing, the cars weren't quite as fast as I wanted them to be. So that's why we've gone up to 100 on these levels. But chassis, extremely important, crucial on the short tracks with a spread of about 30. So again, depending on the amount of randomness and variability you want in your race results and the race positions during the course of a race is to how wide these spreads are going to be. Obviously, if you go 0 to 100, that's going to give you a huge spread because when the game assigns a value before the race weekend, who knows what you're going to get. So you might have a driver finish dead last in one race and get lapped, while the next race he might win and dominate. So you can do that. For me, I like to keep enough spread so that the same drivers are running up front, but not always in the top 3 to top 5, and certainly not always leading. So that's the way these are set up. So 70 to 100, that gives a pretty decent spread for me. And then finally with the engine, 55 to 100, so a little bit wider spread here. And again, the wider the spread, the more variability you're going to get in the results. So that's what it looks like for the late models. And again, these are all personal preference. And if you have any questions, I'll do my best to answer them in the comments below. However, I will tell you that the best way to get in touch with me if you have a specific question is to use the Discord server in the link in the description below. That gives us a lot more, a better framework in order for you to ask questions and me to answer them as best we can without having to go through the comment section in YouTube. So that's going to do it for today. Hopefully that answers some of your questions as to how I set up my car sets and my ratings. And stay tuned as we will now get into some gameplay with the late model series.